Welcome back to the Argentina Project podcast at the Latin American program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm Benjamin Gadan, and I have back here in the studio Professor Stephen Kaplan from George Washington University. Welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me in the studio again. Pleasure to be here.
So President Obama's line on China and Latin America was fairly consistent, and this is what the State Department consistently communicated. China was a resource for development in a capital-scarce region, though U.S. firms offered higher labor and environmental standards and greater transparency. We have just learned that the Trump administration sees it considerably differently and takes a very different tone. In remarks before his Latin America trip, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said of China that China offers the appearance of an attractive path to development, but in reality, this often involves trading short-term gains for long-term dependency. Tillerson went on that China offers come at a price, usually in the form of state-led investments carried out by imported Chinese labor, onerous loans, and unsustainable debt. The Chinese model, he said, extracts precious resources to feed its own economy, often with disregard for the laws of the land or human rights. China is gaining a foothold in Latin America, Secretary Tillerson warns. It is using economic statecraft to pull the region into its orbit. Latin America does not need new imperial powers that seek only to benefit their own people. It's an ominous and very, very gray view of China's role in Latin America. You are an expert on the subject. Were you surprised by that tone?
Yes, I was surprised about the tone. I think any time when you look at a creditor's involvement in a region, it's important to evaluate it based upon costs and benefits. I think here, why I was a little surprised at the tone, is it's an amplification of the costs without the consideration of the benefits. So certainly, right, I think there are lots of kernels of concerns, right, within the comments that I think do ring true, right? There are kernels of concerns about, sort of China's promotion of its own firms, labor, machinery with state-to-state contracts. There's been many conversations within the region about concerns for environmental and labor protections, and even his point about the possibility of governments with these state-to-state deals spending beyond their means, right? So there are, some costs to think about, but I think the way to think about these costs is within the overall balance of investment risks, right? And from that perspective, what I'm really concerned about is with the framing of the issue itself, right? Because I also think China does represent, right, as you mentioned sort of earlier with Obama commentary, a development opportunity for the region simultaneously, right? You have countries with long-standing infrastructure deficits in need of capital, and you have an opportunity through China to help finance these infrastructure projects, right? Argentina, case in point, you have $33 billion, right, of infrastructure spending planned through 2019. They'll be looking to the West, but also to China in order to fill these infrastructure needs. And I think increasingly there's also the idea that when you build this infrastructure, it can spur growth and development. So ultimately, I think when it comes down to evaluating a creditor within the region, whether it's the United States or whether it's China, it really comes down to the balance of risks. And also, let's not forget, these are sovereign nations, right? These are sovereign nations that are able to evaluate these costs and benefits on their own. And I'm sure each nation can evaluate sort of the benefit of having this Chinese capital against some of the risks that we've highlighted already.
I thought it was notable, the phrase, bring the region into its orbit. I mean, it gets at motivations or suspected motivations of the Chinese, which could very well be different than its actual demonstrated behavior. And that I wanted to dig into a little bit with you, because I know you focus on this question of, is Chinese finance very different functionally than a lot of the traditional sources of Western capital for the region?
Yes, so I think, historically, there are cases, or sort of the first, sort of character of Chinese investment in the region. The first characterization was undoubtedly one where it was state-to-state investment, right? And with that state-to-state investment, I think traditionally you have a long time horizon, which helps create a potential development opportunity, because particularly with large infrastructure deals, historically, the region at times has had a timing mismatch, right, where they have long-term development needs but short-term financing. So China, with a longer-term horizon focused on infrastructure, that does sort of help countries overcome this timing mismatch, right? So certainly, from that perspective, a lot of the investments initially from China were state to state. I think one thing that is perhaps lost in the commentary from Tillerson is how much China is actually diversifying what it's doing in the region. He actually makes a statement that China's state-to-state model is reminiscent of the past. In some ways, I think there are probably some leaders within China that might even agree with him, right? From the standpoint, at least within Latin America, they are diversifying their investment tools, right? So certainly you have countries like Ecuador, which still today has a lot of state-to-state led investment, but there's also a lot of other kind of investment going on in the region, right? There's a lot of other investment tools being used.
You bring up Ecuador, and I think that's important because let's be fair to Secretary Tillerson and those that think in the way he does. There are countries already in the region who have some serious regrets about the depth of their engagement with China. Ecuador principally among them, the amount of debt and oil obligations they now have. I think whenever there's a transition in Venezuela, you can bet they will look back with some great regret at the role China has played in promoting corruption and sustaining a model that was unsustainable.
Sure. So I think when you have these state-to-state investments, the key question is going to be local governance, right? So yes, it represents an opportunity, but then there's a question of what governments do with that, right? So it represented an opportunity for Venezuela, represents an opportunity for Ecuador as well. In the case of Venezuela, a lot of the funds from China weren't dedicated towards the kind of infrastructure projects that would create economic growth. Comparatively, you have had a lot of infrastructure built within Ecuador. There's still a question of whether, the infrastructure projects have been the best choices for Ecuador, along with the cost of those infrastructure projects, which is a high opportunity cost in terms of having to deliver future oil. Now, thinking about the diversification, right, because there's a state-to-state led risk there, but just to kind of highlight particularly what Chinese investors have started to do in the region is they're using more market-oriented vehicles. What do I mean by this? Basically, state-run private equity funds. So the capital is still coming from policy banks as well as SAFE, which manages China's reserves. And you have funds that have been created, about $30 billion of funds, including the Brazil-China Cooperation Fund, the China-Latin American Infrastructure Fund, and the China-Latin American Cooperation Fund. And essentially what they're doing is they're investing directly into corporate entities in the marketplace, in manufacturing, agriculture, energy, logistics, and technology. So basically what China's increasingly doing in the region is using other investment tools beyond the state-to-state type of financing, in part because of what's happened in the region in places like Venezuela historically.
Excellent. Dr. Kaplan, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.